Good morning, everybody. Oops. I turned the words around in the title. That saved me one slide, because this way I can use it as a table of contents. I'm going through these kind of words and these topics. I don't have any declaration of financial interest, and that is in spite of the fact that I do have a Swiss bank account, but I do not hide anything of interest there. It's also in spite of the fact that I do try to make a living with this kind of research. Well, the promise, MRS, it's a running gag, has had promise for all the time that it has been there, and people are to blame for all these headlines. I'm among the authors that claimed all that much promise, and the question, of course, is there more than promise? You will very quickly realize that this is not really a very scientific talk. This is more kind of an opinion preaching that I'm doing here. So to base the opinion a little bit on what other people think, I did a little survey trying to reach out into experts and non-expert areas. I asked people I knew, the experts. I also asked 500 people who had done a spectroscopy course with the European School of MRI, though not 500 responded, as you can imagine. But at least I got some opinion back from what people think about the current state of MRS and the ideal state of MRS. So I asked them, what kind of percentage do you think MRS should be included in a MR exam in the clinic to make a clinical decision? And as you can see here, for sites without a local expert, people think only about 2% of the cases could use MRS, and if there's an expert on site, people thought it was about 10% of cases that should have spectroscopy. That was pretty much the same whether these people were clear expert or self-declared experts or non-experts. So, 10%, well, what is the current usage really? I got the numbers for Switzerland, where MRS is reimbursed, and as you can see here, over the last 5 years, only about 0.25% of all MR cases did actually include spectroscopy, and we don't know whether it was useful. So, it's really a marginal modality. If you want to calculate how many cases that would be for your own practice, that's about 1 case per 5,000 inhabitants per year. And it's done more in private clinics than in university settings. I did also ask what kind of areas do you think MRS really has a role? Now this probably is very small. Hope you can read it a little. Over here you can the categories are all brain tumors, general localization, differential diagnosis, treatment, biopsy planning, stuff like that. So I asked them to judge whether it was useful always, often, occasionally, or never, according to numbers 1 to 4. And you see that people think that in areas like MS or stroke, there's really no role for MRS, whereas people thought in the tumor cases there is some role. Hardly ever said never. Hardly anybody said never. Some people even said you should have it always. And of course, the prime role of spectroscopy was seen in metabolic disease. Well, what they actually do is different in their own practice. This down here was a general recommendation. And we've seen throughout this week already, in several cases, there is a role for in tumor characterization, I guess. The trouble is that out in clinical practice, in the non-specialized areas or the centers, they're really the prime tools you have seen this week, like in Hobie Hedrick's talk. All these tools are not there. So what people really have is probably some sort of a CSI, maybe at long echo times, medium echo times. They have a little bit of, or they have single voxel spectroscopy at short TE, and have some sort of hand-waving interpretation, mostly being done while high choline is tumor, but usually the methodology is not that great. You have asymmetries in there that not everybody's aware of. So the role for MRS in tumor diagnosis differentiation, it has changed over the years. There have been highs and lows. Started off promising in 89, 93. Henning's group decided it wasn't really useful. Then it really took off with Doug Arnold's paper, Nature Medicine, in 96. Very first time really used statistical tools to diagnose or to differentiate tumors, and that seemed to be extremely useful. We came back to Earth somehow with the eTumor, our Interpret project, European project, and I think that's probably the most useful tool there is out there right now. And these people really have done a great job in having biopsy-proven cases, lots of them, and looked at average spectra and put that all into a database, a statistical database that can be used to kind of target, to plug in a new case, and you kind of see where in the hyperplane between all these types your new case might lie, and you can compare visually what it could be that you have there as a case. There's also new stuff coming out. I'll come back to that towards the end. Well, spectroscopy is useful in more than just tumors, as I said, metabolic disease. And of course also this, I was stupid enough to group stroke and hypoxia in the same category, which was not good, because in stroke there probably is no role, but in hypoxia there is. And if you ever want to see cases where spectroscopy is really useful, listen to a talk of Elsie Danielson. She has a lot of these cases. I just stole one or two here. Hypoxia in neonates. So this is two cases. First case, 22-hour-old newborn, very bad prognosis, because it is has very low APGAR scores. There's severe hypoxic injury because of cord strangulation during birth. And if you look at the spectra, there's a lot of lactate, there's very little Na, prognosis bad, and the outcome was very bad. Whereas in a very similar case, where the MRI was the same, also diffusion, there was no diffusion difference. In this baby here, the Na was not so low, there's very little lactate, and doctors and everybody was very surprised to see this kind of a normal spectrum in this acute case. And so the prognosis was really much better and the outcome was good. And that's very, very helpful to know at an early stage. Well, same review for body application. I'm not going to go into that. Some role seen for prostate and for breast cancer there. Another horrible table. I'm going to color it to make it a bit easier. Question was, what does it take to have successful MRS? So what people think we need down here is a radiologist, neuroradiologist who is specialized in reading MR spectra. People think it's not sufficient to have any kind of expert, like myself probably, to read spectra. And I think that has a good reason. You really have to integrate all the information there is from your MR exam. People also think you should have a specialized technician and you should have an expert for technical issues on site. And you should know something about normal controls. You should have your own database of control spectra. They don't think you need a particular system. It's a state-of-the-art system, but not of a specific vendor. So how I see it right now, there's essentially spectroscopy on two levels, or graded with two extremes. The best you can do as a clinical user really is to use the tools you have, obviously. That means acquisition, pre-scan, everything is what the manufacturer provides. That's just different for every manufacturer. Methods are different, but you do what you have. Quantitation is often used just ratios or with reference to non-suppressed water. There's total water. Data processing very often with the manufacturer tools. You need local experience to judge spectral quality. And of course, decisions are mostly made kind of hand-waving arguments, comparison to literature and not to your own experience, really. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have the research user level, the researcher who does everything different than the manufacturer. He does it better, but it's again non-standardized, and it's hard for other users to do it in the same way. So consequences of that would be on the clinical user level, well, there is no widespread use of MRS because you need a local expert and there are not that many around. It can only be used for black and white questions. You really need very robust applications to get a definitive answer from your spectra. And of course, there's substantial danger of misdiagnosis. The research level, you can get very nice applications, do nice research. You're also helpful in the clinic, but that means that your top-level researcher has to be there in the clinic, and that may not be his first idea of what he does throughout the day. And it's difficult to reestablish everything if you have to reestablish also the methodology. Now it's getting even smaller print because I have an open-ended question here. Where are the problems with MRS? Essentially, there are 6 groups of difficulties that people came up with. One side is the provider side, that is the radiology factor, the human factor there, missing experience, missing education. There is the client side, the clinician who doesn't know, who isn't educated for the use of it, so he doesn't have the idea what to do. There are inherent technical limits, lack of potential, then all the technicalities, and finally some people also blame the vendors and the lack of reimbursability. Let me go through some of these factors and first turn to inherent technical limits. Of course, there are inherent technical limits. There is low SNR, this is low SNR technique, there are artifacts. And this cartoon I got some years back from Ivan, I always still love it, and I'm going to show it here again. You can have perfect spectra in the ideal world, or in Minnesota obviously. If you're at 7T, then you come back to Earth and you have artifacts, you have different artifacts, you have noise, you have bad shimming. So if you are at this point, you have inherent problems, signal to noise, and you also have homemade problems because your implementation wasn't that great, and most of us live at 3T, and then you even have everything on top of each other. So, technicalities, what's the problem with that? The main thing is what people noted, and this is also my opinion, things are not standardized, it's not automated. That's the main problem. But really, it shouldn't be, because tools are there, we could standardize. Maybe not on the top-notch level, but on a very good level we could standardize. In 94 already, G sites showed that if you do things identically, automatically, you could get very nice reproducibility. And there's now just going on an initiative from Minnesota. Gulinas is trying to establish a multi-site verification of the semi-laser technique where you can get very nice reproducibility. And this is planned for multi-vendor, so maybe we get there. For CSI, Andrew Maudsley has shown 5 years back, 6 years back, that tools are there, and we can do much more than what is presently being done in the clinic. He has shown this wonderful averaged brains, if you really register everything to each other, if you calibrate properly. These things can be done, and this also, I think, is a multi-site project. I'm not sure whether it's multi-vendor, but certainly multi-site. So, yes, technicalities are there, and I think they could be solved. There remains the problem of the artifacts that are not eye-catching, and I'm probably to blame myself to have pointed at that, and Shakespeare said that hell is empty and all the devils are here. That's probably what you think at times when you look at your spectra. But also these artifacts, most of them could be prevented if you really try and if you have the proper tools. So the main artifact often is motion. But there are tools against that. So Thomas Ernst group showed that if you have the baseline scan, you prescribe in the anterior cingulate here, and person moves, then of course you take the spectrum from another part of the brain. It looks completely different. But if you navigate, and there are tools for navigation, in a way we live off the table of the rich fMRI people probably, but why not? You can get the proper spectrum back. There's a problem with the shim, which was here solved artificially, but there was a recent paper, a recent work by the MGH group, got these slides from Aaron Hess. You can actually see if you have motion, people can navigate to find the proper location, and they even do shimming and frequency alignment on the fly. So if you have this case here, 5-year-old child who moved in the middle of the scan, not 10 centimeters, but 1 centimeter, which would be enough to get very bad spectra if you don't notice that and don't correct for it. But with this correction, you really remain with a very nice spectrum. So the tools are out there, let's use them. And tell your vendor that you want to use them. Automatic quality control is certainly not solved yet, but there have been approaches, particularly this one, again from the Interpret group of people, where they, for a certain set of spectra, really were able to train a computer to find the artifacts and to find the bad spectra. I think that's where we have to go. So, don't have time to go through all this in detail, kind of certain criteria for the human expert, which were then used to train the computer. There was some independent component analysis, support vector machine, classifiers. Spectroscopists don't always agree. There was only 85% agreement, and the computer agreed with 87% with the human experts, so that was quite good. Example spectra, these are spectra where the human and the machine thought they are no good. Here actually the humans thought they were good and the computer said that they are not so great. So here's a vision. We should have identical MRS sequences on all vendor machines. Maybe the semi-laser technique has some advantages. It should have the same pulses, the same water suppression, and we should have sort of the same shimming and optimization on each vendor site, because it just seems that this would be the way to go to make it really clinical. My view is we should have the processing on the scanner or on the vendor work site, because otherwise it's just not going to be in the clinic. And it should be a professional stuff like LC model or all of these techniques, whatever the vendors could agree on and pay for. In the end, we pay for it. If we have that, then I think then we can really have universal diagnostic criteria, because we can have the same standard normal values for everybody, and we can use stuff that in the literature to diagnose things, and not just in a hand-waving way. There's still a little work for the quality criteria and the automatic definition, so initially probably would still need some expertise at least. Well, of course, the final objection is there is no lack of potential in the first place. Then we don't need to standardize, because then it's of no use. I certainly do not agree there. I mean, if you look into the tumor world, there are not just 3 peaks there. If you do it right, meningiomas seem to have a glutathione level that is higher, here the glutathione spectrum, compared to normal white matter here, independent of whether there is alanine or not in these meningiomas. And as I mentioned before, there's new stuff out there. Sorry. 2-hydroxyglutarate has been detected, and that seems to be excuse me. That seems to be differentiating some glioma types, and the outcome for those patients seem to depend on this IDH mutation, isocitrate dehydrogenase, that is, deciding on whether you have 2HD in your spectrum. Here, seen at this little blob here, for the mutated case, for the wild type here. Now you may think that's a very small peak, I don't trust that. It's 2D, I don't trust 2D. Here's a different paper in Nature Medicine just recently using an optimized press sequencer, essentially showing the same results, and they even showed a map for 2HG here. So there's stuff out there, and I think it should be used, and I think it would be of value in the clinic. Coming to potential, so even where could we even do much better? Well, people have combined several echo time spectroscopy for brain tumor classification, and that seems to help, not just visually looking at both spectra, but actually integrating it in the automatic analysis tool. There's possibility to fit different spectra simultaneously. We are working on that a little. Our FITAID tool, where we use not just one single voxel spectrum with one echo time, but maybe combine stuff with different inversion times or different echo times, and evaluate these spectra simultaneously. Then there's the multimodality approach that has been mentioned a lot, that we should be multimodal, and I think I totally agree there. It's no use to have just to rely on one spectrum and try to solve the world of that. It has to be read in the context of the whole exam. And if you look at this slide that was given to me from Andrew Maudsley, and you really get all the metabolite maps with his tool, and you combine this information with diffusion information, perfusion information, T1, T2, and contrast information. And if you get all this simultaneously on your workstation, I think it's a really helpful tool to include this metabolic information. Finally, you have heard about this throughout the week. This was on Tuesday. I mean, we can look at the non-steady state now, or well, it's not in the clinic yet. It is potential. We don't know whether we will succeed there, but certainly if we look at enzyme activity, metabolic pathways, it's probably something on the horizon which will give more than information than what we have now from steady state. Here, prostate cancer, first clinical results from the San Francisco group. And going even further, I got this slide from Kevin Brindle and his work. He suggests that using malate as a contrast agent, C13 contrast agent, would even be better than pyruvate for this case of tumor monitoring, treatment monitoring, because the reason here is that you only convert fumarate to malate if the fumarate actually sees the respective enzyme. The enzyme is hidden in the cells. You don't get a turnover as long as the cells are healthy and going strong. As soon as they are dying, this enzyme gets into contact with the agent, and you get malate from it. So if the treatment works, the malate signal increases. If it doesn't work, you don't get dead cells. The answer remains the same. So this is something on the horizon. There's many more things on the horizon that there is potential for our method. So take-home messages. There has been promise. I think rightfully there has been promise, but not everything worked out, which is normal. But there are many reasons for the pitfalls. Mostly misuse, I think. I mean, people have been overusing it in cases where there's no use for it, and that gives it a very bad reputation. It has also been used by non-experts with technical problems. Pitfalls. There are lots of pitfalls, but I think many can be prevented if you really have the good techniques for it, and if we try to educate people better, and if we have standardization. I think there is power, and you can see my thoughts about that. I'm not sure whether it really will be a push-button method and any tech can do it and things are great, but I think the level of expertise you will need at local sites can be much lower if there is standardization. And finally, as I just alluded to, there's lots of potential out there. Working together, multimodality, and new applications are my favorite potentials out there. And with that, I thank you for your attention.